Welcome all to this Earnscliffe second edition of Live from Glasgow, a review of what happened at the COP26 conference. My name is Allan Gregg, the principal at Earnscliffe, working out of Toronto. I'm joined with my colleagues, same panel as we had about 10 days ago. Velma McColl is our environmental, sustainable, clean tech expert. She has been in Glasgow for the last 12 days. Rick Anderson is an expert in energy policy, among other things. He's been an advisor to kings and queens all over the world, also at Glasgow, and a relatively new addition to the Earnscliffe team, part of the panel from last week, but he's still a new guy, so we'll make him monitor the Q&As that the audience is invited to contribute. Before joining Earnscliffe, Bud Locklear was a senior advisor for energy and environment in the U.S. Embassy out of Ottawa. As I mentioned, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Those who are viewing, listening are invited to offer in any questions to either an individual panelist or the entire group, and then we will go to you a couple times over the course of the next hour of conversation. I want to start with Velma and Rick, and just talk about because you've been in Glasgow for the last 12 days, just about a very high level takeaway on your experience there. First, Velma, this is your 10th Conference of the Parties, as they are called. How does this one compare to other real seminal events that have taken place in the past, like Paris and Copenhagen and Kyoto, in terms of progress was made? How would you rate this one?
Thanks, Alan. This one was an implementation COP. So I've been going to these since COP6. This is COP26. This one was about implementation. There was a lot of momentum. This is also a COP where the inside and the outside work together pretty seamlessly, and all add to us getting where we need to get.
Rick, this was your first. Talk to me just about the experience and your expectations going in versus what you saw throughout, and what your general sense was of the whole experience.
You know, I've been to a lot of political conventions over the years. This is one of the biggest Canadian political conventions I've been to, times 10, in terms of the number of people who were there. And it had a lot of the kind of same feelings of a political convention, of a lot of politics, obviously, and a lot of politicians, a lot of people mingling in the halls, and out for dinner, and in the bars, and all that kind of stuff. But there was also just a vast array of, it was overwhelming how many different sidebar panels and conferences and workshops and so on were going on the main campus, but really all over the place in Glasgow.
How many
and wherever you went, you ran into people who were part of that.
How many Canadians were there, if you had to guess?
It was roughly 200 Canadians, and it was this fantastic array of people, from city councillors. I met someone, I'm from Kimberley, BC, and I met a councillor from Rossland, who was there with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. The program that the Indigenous Clean Energy put on was fantastic. The youth delegation was amazing for Canada. We had folks from nature and environment, and both in the formal delegation and then in the blue and the green zones. There were a lot of Canadians here. Many of them were doing business. Many of them were listening to what's happening, but a lot of them were also doing business and talking to other countries about what it is that they're doing on the technology front.
I want to talk about the different delegations and their involvement and activity, but first, Bud, I mean, you've been sitting back and watching this thing closely. Now that it's over, that they've issued the declaration, what's your overall reaction? Where have they made progress, and where have they failed to move the yardsticks forward to a better world?
Well, from my perspective, Alan, the Article 6 agreement, that is having to do with the arrangement for emissions credit trading, that's a significant breakthrough. I mean, it's going to unleash a global market for GHG emissions credits and trading. So that's an important part of the financial solution to climate change. So that's on the plus side. On the minus side, I think the fact that China and India managed to I think, mute the coal phase out to a coal phase down was significant. And I would point out the United
I could say at the very last minute.
at the very last minute, yeah. I understand that the UN President Sharma was in tears, when this happened. So that's a downer.
Same question to you first, Rick, and then Velma. I mean, where did you see the most progress being made, and where were the most roadblocks to progress?
For me, it was the scope of the plans that governments were coming forward with not just at the conference itself, but during the 6 months preceding it. I mean, really kicked off by Prime Minister Boris Johnson and by President Biden by demanding or requesting or urging or strong arming countries to come to this conference with strengthened goals and strengthened plans for meeting them. And the second part of it was those strengthened plans. Those are becoming much more material. It's the main reason that I was interested in being there firsthand, as opposed to watching it from a distance, because there's always been a bit of a gap in my mind. I mean, I think most of us would agree between the goal setting and the actions behind the goals and the meeting of the goals, but it feels like that's changing. And that's why I was really interested in being there. And my expectations were fulfilled.
Velma, where was the most progress made and where was the least?
So I would say 1.5 degrees Celsius as the limit. What is an acceptable limit is baked in a way in the Glasgow Climate Pact, because that's what we call it. We waited for the big reveal at the end to know what we're going to call it and how we're going to describe it going forward. But there is language in the agreement that says impacts of climate change will be much lower at the temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius versus 2 degrees.
Hard now. That's a hard metric.
It's baked in. There's a question about whether we're going to hit it or not. We're at 1.1 right now. Every 10th of a point, a degree Celsius matters in this. But the other thing that's baked in that's important is that we have an alignment, again, both inside the building and outside the building, around net zero by 2050 with hard metrics around 2030 objectives. So the other thing is that there is momentum behind this. So in ways that we didn't meet, objectives around a number of things, there is language in the deal that says that countries are going to align with the Paris Agreement by 2022 and file new NDCs. There is a commitment in the agreement that the Secretary General of the UN will convene in 2023. Leaders, again, we're not waiting until 2025 to have a big conversation about this. And we're going to talk about a bunch of individual things in more detail, but there's a lot of momentum and mechanisms for dialogue and advancing tough conversations in the agreement itself.
But one of the most important outcomes of the conference, at least certainly at a symbolic level, had to be the declaration between China and the United States. But while short on specifics, the very fact that it was made, given the relations of those superpowers, lately was surprising to many. Talk to me about the significance of that declaration in terms of the fight against climate change.
Well,
but let me just go first, because I just want to talk about how it changed the air in the room. That was surprise on Thursday night as negotiations were hitting a critical point. China and the US represent 38% of global emissions. They're the two largest economies, the two largest emitters. Them saying that they're going to work together was a breakthrough in terms of the momentum in the room. This is a tool that Obama used and unleashed some pretty big technology changes. So, Bud, you'll talk more about the specifics, but I just wanted to maybe describe how it changed the air and the dynamic in the room.
So it was a surprising development.
It was a surprise.
But more on this.
Well, Velma nailed it. I mean, this is about continuing the momentum and having the two largest emitters in the world agree. And the backstory to this is a huge amount of conflict, geopolitical tensions. In fact, Secretary Kerry, as the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, had been interacting with the Beijing government since the spring, all through the summer. Very frosty reception at his last meeting in early September that had to be followed up by some calls between Biden and Xi to kind of manage things. Bottom line, there's not a lot of specifics in the agreement, but it's it's really about helping power the momentum that Velma spoke about and was going to continue.
Beyond climate change specifically, I mean, does it signal anything larger in terms of Sino-US relations, over the midterm?
Yes and no. So it's a welcome thaw. And in fact, what we see is President Xi and President Biden are meeting later today to talk about the Sino-US relationship. And on that agenda are things like Taiwan and commitments that China's made to buy American products. So this is one element of building a bridge. We're not out of the woods yet.
Rick, your thoughts on the declaration and its significance?
Well, it improved the ambiance. There's no question about that. It was good to see an agreement between those two countries for all the reasons that have just been referenced. I think that's still a very difficult and probably the world's most difficult relationship. And I also think that China is kind of maybe where other people were at, at the time of Kyoto or Copenhagen or so on, getting ready to do this. And they signaled that. They've signaled that they're not about to start lowering emissions, but they're going to soon. Now, take that with a grain of salt, but it's better than not having said that. I think they're going to come under the same pressure that we've all come under to go along with everybody else, and it'll be harder and harder to resist that. And they'll finally start finding some trade barriers in the end if they don't eventually come along. So I think all of that's starting to take shape, and I think that agreement was part of it.
Do you have any questions there from our listeners and viewers that you want to put to the panel?
Indeed, I do. One of the questions is with respect to the double counting of emissions credits pursuant to Article 6, and how did negotiators in Glasgow overcome that issue, or is it really still an issue that the details need to be hammered out on?
First, before we go to Velma, Rick, just explain for those who, like me, who don't really understand our Article 6, what we're talking about here.
Well, I'll let Velma and Rick do that.
Rick?
And this will be once over lightly, because this is more than 10 years of detailed negotiations, and I haven't seen the final text yet. And but once over lightly, the Article 6 sets up the accounting and rule book, the mechanisms by which emissions reductions are accounted for and traded within a system. And I put Article 6 with the $100 billion a year for climate finance, and with the 130 trillion mobilized by Mark Carney and GFANZ, that those things are a set. And so those things facilitate those. To the specific question that was asked, Bud, that was part of what has taken us so long to get there. And the question of double counting, I believe, has been addressed in the current rules. Technical discussion to follow if whoever posed that question wants to reach out.
Well, if I could just add to it and bring it home to Canada, we were one of the people really pushing for resolution of this question, because people have heard of LNG Canada. It's the biggest privately funded infrastructure project in the country's history, and the purpose of that is to export LNG from Canada, liquefied natural gas from Canada to Asia, where it would be mostly used to displace coal in the making of electricity and producing of electricity, with a tremendous reduction in the emissions, GHG emissions, as a result of that transition. The way things work now, Canada pays the price in terms of emissions being counted against us for extracting the gas and for liquefying it, whereas the countries and the companies that are using it on the other side of the equation end up getting all the credit for the emission reduction. And so, since the days of Jean Chrétien, we've been complaining about that because it's a good thing for us to do the transaction that we're talking about. It saves the planet important amounts of emissions, and we get no credit for it. In fact, we get penalized by having the emissions counted against. Well, what I think they've agreed here, and I don't think that anybody's seen the text here outside the negotiators yet, is that they've agreed to treat it as a commercial transaction, where the parties to the transaction can decide how to split the credit for that emission reduction between them as a commercial matter.
The Prime Minister, when he was at the conference earlier, urged pricing of carbon. Is that part of this? Did we contribute to the Article 6 resolution?
Well, I would separate what he's talking about with pricing as a mechanism. It's sort of a foundational piece that he believes, 17% of global emissions are covered by carbon pricing right now. The target is to get it to 60%. And so there's a belief that making that move to a price underlies and strengthens everybody's nationally determined commitments, NDCs. So that's the belief. In some instances, carbon pricing does fit into a carbon trading system. So Article 6 does feed it, but not universally.
But President Biden is going to meet with the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of Mexico this week, the three amigos. And clearly one of the top items on their agenda is going to be the generous incentives the president is offering for Buy American electric vehicles, something that is believed to hurt both the Canadian and the Mexican automotive industry. For me, one of the most interesting developments at COP 2026 was the refusal of the two largest automotive manufacturers to sign on to Route Zero, the agreement to end emissions for road transportation. And the argument they made is that there simply is not enough infrastructure, plug-in capacity throughout the world to meet that goal. How much does that impact on Biden's ambitions regarding EV conversion?
Well, there's actually a very interesting situation here in that it's Volkswagen and Toyota that have not signed on. Toyota actually has a vision of moving towards hydrogen fuel cells, which is counter to where most people think electric vehicles are going to go. So I sort of see some of their vision there. Before I dig into that on the EV subsidies, let me just note that this meeting of the NALS leaders, the North American Leaders Summit, with the Mexican president, López Obrador, one of the challenges is he is not on the same page with the United States and Canada in terms of climate.
No, he sees fossil fuel as a national resource.
Absolutely, and he's disincentivized any kind of movement towards renewable energy or reducing the significance of the fossil fuel sector in Mexico. Now, that's hugely in contrast with the 2016 NALS meeting when his predecessor, President Obama and Prime Minister Trudeau all met and had an enormously successful meeting with very detailed energy, environment, and climate action plan. So that's setting the stage for the NALS. When we talk about the US effort, look, that $12,500 kind of a subsidy that's available, portions of that are going to be knocked off. Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who's the key Democratic power broker in this issue, has said he's opposed to the extra subsidies provided for union-made automobiles. He called them un-American or not American anyways, and not fair. So that's still up in the air whether those extensive subsidies are really going to see the light of day.
Rick, I mean, you've been telling us all along that the real measure of COP26 was whether they could finalize the Paris 2015 playbook. Talk to us about the goals that have been set in terms of getting to 1.5 and what that might mean. Just before I get there, I read a fascinating thing that of the 74 countries that have actually set goals, only 17 have brought this into law. Are we going to see significant movement into more of these countries buying in to goals that's going to get us to 1.50 by the end of the century?
Yes, I think we already are seeing that trend, and I think we're going to see it accelerate. There was certainly lots of evidence of that at this meeting. You know, in Canada, the version of it is we legislated the net zero 2050 targets. People say, well, you know, what does that mean, setting a legal target for something 30 years from now? That there are a lot of factors behind. Well, it's not just that. It's that the government's required to provide 5-year milestone reports as to what has happened towards those goals. First of all, it's got to set a set of milestones between now and 2050. So it's not all just kind of, you know, now till 2049, it's kind of more or less business as usual. And in the last year, we'll solve the problem. You know, you've got to set goals for each of the 5-year periods and then do reports on it. And if we're not meeting those goals, you've got to, at that point in time, put on the table a plan that will rectify that. Now, of course, this is parliamentary legislation. It could be tossed out or modified by future governments. We've seen that before on things like tax increases and so on. So people can discount that, but it's happening because the political will to do this is there, and it exists in more than one party. It's broadly based in public opinion. And finally, what we're getting, and this is what I think is the most important ingredient, we haven't really talked about that much here yet, is that industry and investors are both coming on side with that. The biggest oil producers in Canada, the 6 companies that produce 95% of oil sands oil, have agreed with net zero 2050. The biggest countries in the world who are producing oil and gas are agreeing with net zero 2050. Whether they legislate it or not, they're making commitments to each other. And whereas with Kyoto, we all kind of went and made an agreement, back in 1997, and went home and probably did almost nothing about it. I mean, that's not quite true. We were doing things about acid rain and CFCs and in Canada, coal phase out of electricity and so on that actually contributed to leveling our emissions and stopping their growth. But we weren't serious yet about making those targets. Well, now the conversation has moved from how big is your target to how good is your plan? And show me how we're actually proceeding against the plan that you told us about last year. That's what Velma was just referring to, which is one of the next COPs is going to have to, people are going to have to come again and speak not just about targets raising, but how they're proceeding towards them.
I want to drill down with Velma on that, on the commitments and targets, because you and Rick circulated a paper to the Earnscliffe team by Carbon Brief. And it talked about a credibility gap, basically accusing a lot of these delegate countries of kicking the can down the road, that their 2050 aspirations look great and get us to 1.50, but their plan between now and 2030 is too anemic to actually get us to that end essentially. Do you buy that? And you have to have a view on that point of view? I mean, that was surprising to me.
Right. So that is the gap. And one of the things that is in the Glasgow Climate Pact is that it says align with the Paris Agreement for both the 2030 and 2050 goals. So there's a recognition. And I mean, we can't forget that in Paris, we had no global accounting for emissions. We had no way of saying what the trajectory was. We had no way of checking what it is that countries are going to do or not do. We have that now. It was updated on November 4th. It can be updated with every time someone files an obligation, because I think we have to remember a couple of things here. Despite everything that happened in Glasgow, we are not on track to hit 1.5. And we're, in some instances, we're not on track to hit 2. So the 2030 timeframe to accelerate action in a whole bunch of areas is where the focus is. And that's why those milestones for 2022 and 2023 are important, because we're not, despite our 5-year windows, we're not going to sit still until 2025 and say, oh, oops, we missed again. There are things, we're leaning in a way that we haven't before, and we're leaning in against a trajectory that I think everybody recognizes has to change. The other thing that's interesting is that all of this conversation that we're having with Bud and Rick about oil and gas or EVs or other kinds of things, that's exactly an implementation challenge. That's a challenge about how we're going to actually do this. And this business about phase down of coal and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, that's the first time fossil fuel subsidies and coal have been in the agreement. It's not as much as a lot of people wanted. It was a last minute change. So there's a governance question here. There were the countries that spoke in that final impassioned a few hours were small island states, and they were saying this is not a fair process because you didn't let us talk about loss and damage and other kinds of things. So we have a process problem here inside these meetings, but China and India did actually recommend that the clause be dropped altogether. So these are the engaged conversations, and there is an accelerating S curve. We can talk about that a little bit more.
We're going to talk about the developed versus the undeveloped world and technology in the S curve. But first on implementation, because you raised this, I think it's very important. I wanted to ask Bud again specifically about the United States. I mean, a lot of the happy talk around a conference like COP26 is that all we really need is the political will and the political ambition to get this done. You look at the United States and what seemingly uncompromising opposition to a number of climate change initiatives in Congress on one hand, and then a progressive wing of the House of Assembly for which nothing seems to be enough. I mean, how much is just raw politics the single greatest barrier towards climate change programs and policy and implementation in the United States?
It's a huge barrier. I mean, the polarized nature of the US political ecosystem at this moment just means you can't have a rational conversation on climate policy and the broader economic issues. And the divisions within parties, within the Democratic Party in particular, is a challenge. If we look back just a couple of weeks to the victory in Virginia of the Republican candidate for governor, that's a harbinger for election watchers of, a huge win probably for the Republicans in the House in the November 2022 elections.
Sure.
So and what that means basically is that the executive branch of the United States, President Biden and his team, don't have a lot of leeway, don't have a lot of political wiggle room to do statutory issues and do big ticket things because they're going to be stymied in Congress. So everything's political right now. It's going to become even more political as soon as we enter 2022.
But
That's where implementation takes place. And the implementation doesn't take place at the COP conference. It takes place off the ground on domestic politics. Rick?
But saying it's political has different meanings, right? There's the party political stuff, which is very competitive and adversarial and so on, particularly in the States, but also in Canada. But there's the other kind of politics, which is the public. And if you look at what's happened, the things that have happened around the world that have really started to move the dial in terms of climate policy are being driven by public opinion and not being driven by parties getting together and doing kumbaya behind closed doors in the national capitals. The United States, the national government of the United States is going to be the least important, I'm sorry to put it this way, player in this, although they've got a very powerful bully pulpit. Most of the action in the United States is about at the state and local level. Most of the serious policy, the pricing that's going on in the country, the zero emission mandates in the States, zero emission vehicle mandates in the States are coming from states. The coal phase out, in Washington, they have a fight about whether or not we should be phasing out coal. At the state level, it's happening. The use of coal to produce electricity has fallen by half in the United States in the last decade. And that's because of local public opinion. People don't want that coal generating plant down the street from them. And that's what triggered, Premier Harris. It wasn't his, love of climate policy or that discussion that triggered him to close the first coal plant in Ontario 21 years ago. It was brown skies over Toronto and air quality warnings.
I want to put Velma into this, but first, Bud, you must have a reaction to what Rick just said.
It all comes down to dollars, and the dollars come from the Congress, and that's where basically the money, the money bag is there, and limitations on the ability of the federal government to throw money out for infrastructure, even though they got a huge win with the infrastructure bill, means that the progress will be slower than we would like to see.
Val, talk to us about the domestic politics of implementation in Canada, uniquely to the United States.
Sure. Let me just add to Rick's point about state and local government. 700 cities in 50 countries have set targets, independent of whatever the federal politics are, what their national politics are. And those are people who are very activist. Those are mayors who are on the front lines, and they are extremely activist about how they're going to hit it. And they're asking very practical implementation problems. Canada, I don't think we need to translate what happened in Glasgow into our domestic conversation. And we need a national conversation about hitting net zero. Like, we had legislation what's passed in June, and then we had a federal election, and we haven't really had a chance to kind of let it land what 5-year rolling targets around net zero 2050 is. And I think, frankly, we haven't had a very serious conversation about the 2030, the accelerating 2030 timetable. It's there and it's happening in a few places, but this is not. And we all need to come away from Glasgow knowing that governments alone, no amount of money coming out of Congress is going to solve climate change alone. No money or no legislation and no regulation from the federal government in Canada will solve climate alone. It is the movement by a number of state and non-state actors together that will accelerate that timetable. So in a piece I wrote, I said we should be having a national summit. We had a climate summit in 2016. We need an update on 2030 and 2050.
Couldn't agree more with that.
Velma, do you expect, let me just one more of a supplementary to Velma, because I mean, how difficult or easy do you expect that conversation to be in Canada in the current minority parliament?
I actually think, it was so interesting. Look, Dan Albus was on the ground, Elizabeth May was on the ground, Jagmeet Singh was on the ground. Everybody's bringing a slightly different perspective. I noted with great interest the back and forth between Michelle Rempel and John, who's the critic for natural resources, and Jonathan Wilkinson, because I think there is a recognition, because look, that is the thing. We talked about this last time. This isn't just an environmental issue. This is a trade issue. This is an economic issue. This is a nature issue. And this is how we live in this gorgeous country, and the nature agenda is important to us. But solving the nature question is also part of solving climate and hitting 2050 targets and all these dynamics around Article 6, et cetera, not exclusively. So we need the national conversation. And frankly, we look back too much and not forward enough. So again, I think I said on the last conversation, Alberta has something to say on this, but the old politics in the Federation about it's Alberta versus the rest of the country, it's old, and we have an important, engaged national conversation to have about how we're participating in this global trend.
The conservative movement is going to continue to be, the conservative movement in Canada is going to continue to be largely off base with this conversation. But to your question about federal parliament, they're badly outnumbered there, and they're going to continue to lose votes on it to the extent that there are votes, black and white votes. I mean, Aaron O'Toole, to give him his credit, when Canada first endorsed the idea of net zero 2050, said so did the Conservative Party, but then they proceeded to vote against it in Parliament when the bill was actually on the table. They're having a hard time making the transition from seeing this as threat and instead seeing it as opportunity. But that's where they're out of sync, not only with public opinion, even in Alberta, but they're out of sync with the industry. I mean, we've been through, over 30 years, we've been through 2 or 3 generations of leaders and boards of directors of energy companies. And today the question that's being asked in those boardrooms is, what are we going to do to make our business healthy 20 or 30 years ago, 20 or 30 years from now? And they're hiring CEOs who know the answer to that question. And that's why the 6 biggest oil producers in Canada, all of the electric utilities and most of the gas companies are figuring out how to be part of the solution as opposed to be part of the problem.
We talked about that last. I mean, that's a real, landmark change in terms of industry approach to this. Bud, you got any questions from the viewers there that you want to share with the panel?
Yes, a question. Was Greta Thunberg a factor in Glasgow, notably the idea there's been too much talk and not enough action to date? Was that a precipitator to action?
Velma, we talked about that. Glass half full, glass half empty is kind of the viewpoint, depending on what side of pragmatic versus idealist you are. What about Greta?
So look, it's an ecosystem of change. So Greta was outside the building for the entire conference, but she, 100,000 people protested in the streets of Glasgow on the Saturday between week 1 and week 2. She was largely responsible for that. I didn't see what the final number, but they were targeting more than 2 million signatures around the world. She represents she it has become the voice for a generational change, and though that voice won't be silenced, and the Fridays for the Future isn't going away, and the youth being properly represented is there. And I think every leader felt that heat, not just from Greta, but from there's believe me, we feel it too. We hear it from our own children. There are casts of thousands of youth.
Yeah, that generation's got a vested interest in 2050, whereas some of us are saying, well,
yeah, but there are
Rick's play on the impact of the youth delegation there.
Can I just say that they're better briefed on the issues that most adults are? Like they know what 1.5 is, they know what the trajectory is, they know what 2030 means.
Yes, they do, but they don't understand the importance of 2050, and sometimes they discount it, like for instance, Greta does. And it's been transformational for the industry and investor part of this conversation, because no energy infrastructure, clean or dirty, gets built in 5 years. It's a 5-year, 10-year permitting process just to build something. You can say, I'm going to build a wind farm or a hydroelectric dam tomorrow, and you'll still be going through a permitting process and the appeals thereto and the political fallout 10 years from now, never mind getting into production. So as long as people were running around saying, we need to do this right away, instant day after tomorrow, we've only got 5 minutes, all that kind of urgency talk, it limited what everybody could do to some things that were relatively easy to do and relatively small scale. But as soon as we started saying, look, energy infrastructure works on 30, 40, 50-year life cycles, and we have to understand that. And if we want big investors to come in and fund clean energy and close coal plants before their lifespan normal lifespan is finished, or gas plants or whatever it is, if we want those things to happen, we're going to have to be explaining to them in terms that are relevant to investor markets, how to make that work and not have everybody running around with big red ink all over the place. And that has happened. And that's why Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg and so on were able to bring 160 financial institutions, over 200 in the end, financial institutions to the table. And what they're talking about is supplying something in the order of $4 trillion a year of global investor money to clean energy and clean technology investments around the world.
I want to get into the finance aspect, but first I want to bring Bud in on a variation on that theme. When you talk about the polarization in the United States, we also saw in the last Democratic presidential nomination the incredible youth support that Bernie Sanders was able to get, which is, when you look at Bernie Sanders, quite remarkable. And a lot of it is around, social justice and climate. Young people and the progressive wing, the OACs out there, I mean, are they a problem or a part of the solution to climate change implementation and policy in the United States?
Well, I think conversation from as many viewpoints as possible is definitely part of the solution. And even those on the far sides of the spectrum should be able to, make their case. The challenge here is it's not just about the number of voices, it's where those voices are in the way the United States electoral system works to elect a president and manage the executive branch, isn't by the most number of votes that you get. It's the number of electoral votes you get. And so what I'm trying to say here is it's really kind of a complex situation in the United States about that popular sentiment to have things done. And I guess that's why Rick's talking about, you can have things done in California, you're not going to see in Oklahoma. Right?
Any more questions there from viewers?
Got a question here about Canada's status and level of influence at this global forum.
That was in fact a question I wanted to ask Velma. What was the reaction to the Canadian contribution to this conference, Velma?
I think Canada gained some credibility, and frankly, the 1-year delay from COVID between whether COP26 was held in 2020 versus 2021 actually worked to our advantage. We had more specific to say. We had an accounting of what our trajectory is. We had legislation to bring to the table. We have money behind EVs, power changes, clean fuels, etc. We had a credible story. So the influence, and then the other thing is, like, again, diversification of the number of ministers who were there. Minister Freeland was there for Finance Day. Minister Algabra was there for the Transportation Day. Stephen Guilbeault, the new Minister of the Environment, ended up being the lead negotiator. Jonathan Wilkinson was there, played a critical role in the climate finance piece. So we were well represented. In addition to all those, Mike Savage, the mayor of Halifax and the new incoming chair of the Big City Mayors for Canada, was there. And 200 very interesting, fascinating Canadians were also there. So Canada's relative influence, I think, went up at COP26.
The other,
you raised Mark Carney, and I think he was presenting the day after, or maybe even the day of our last webinar. What was the reaction to him personally and the proposal that he was putting forward? What impact did that have on the rest of the deliberations?
So Rick, let me just go super quick and then I'll over to you, because Rick it's got the hand. But look, Mark Carney has not been on this issue for 5 minutes. He's been on this issue since before Paris. And he and Michael Bloomberg have been working at this diligently. And I think one hat tip that we need to give to him as a Canadian is that he actually understands what it takes to move global systems. And so what he pulled together from the private finance side did have a significant impact on what happened with governments.
Rick,
he was a rock star. He was a rock star. He was a rock star there. I mean, he was one of the stars of the show.
Really?
There's no question. He was one of the most important people, one of the most recognized people wandering the halls of that thing, all the way through. Almost all the except for the Article 6 Paris Rulebook stuff, which was concluded at the final days, which is when it was scheduled to conclude. All of the other stuff happened when you were talking about, Alan, in the first 5 days of the conference. There was 2 days of the national leaders. I think Trudeau, to your question about Canada, I think Trudeau acquitted himself very well there. His speech was very good. And he was also part of all the important announcements that were being unfolded on coal, on methane, and deforestation, which were all happening in those early days of the conference, the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of the first week. 2 leader days, then the finance day, you're right, the Carney, Bloomberg, and so on, the big financial institutions, they had their own day on day 3 of this thing, right after the leaders. And then the 4th day was Energy Day. And in that space of that time, most of the things we've been talking about in this conference occurred or announced during that period of time. And Trudeau was part of, probably half of those conversations, Trudeau personally. And I think he acquitted himself better. I can be a hard marker, I think, sometimes. I know I am. But I think he got good marks.
More on some than others.
Pardon?
More on some than others. Finish your point. I interrupted. I'm sorry.
No, he was really part of the conversation, and he wasn't just promising things. Because of what Velma referred to, the fact that the conference was delayed a year, the Canadian government was able, and Canadian Parliament was able to put a lot of meat on the bones of what our policy was since last December, when the Strength and Climate Plan was unfolded, the legislation about net zero 2050, the April budget, billions of dollars, and so on. The robust, we tripled our target for where our carbon pricing is going to be, from $50, more than tripled, to $170 by 2030. He had a story to tell about that, and it wasn't a promise of things he was going to do. It was things that Canada had just done.
It's not just billions, it's trillions. I mean, but we've been following this file for a long time. I mean, what impact does the fact that Mark Carney at least notionally represents $130 trillion of private sector capital that could be invested in this space, what impact does that have on politics and the government officials and their thinking about what they could and could not do on this file?
It opens up a space for action. Absolutely. It shows that this is real. This is a real economic opportunity. It's a real pathway that, with a bit of correct, herding, is going to lead to the results that people want. I mean, this is unleashing the economic forces that are absolutely necessary to get us to a net zero future. It's going to be kind of a long haul. I was speaking with folks in Washington a couple of weeks ago about exactly what Rick was saying in terms of just the star power of Mark Carney is off the charts. The credibility he has in C-suites around the globe is something that is Canada should be absolutely leveraging and be proud of. It's pretty impressive, and it's absolutely essential.
Velma, this wasn't all just about hard metrics and goals and numbers. I mean, there was also serious discussion about diversity and inclusion. To talk to us about, and we don't read that much about those softer, so-called softer issues in the press. Talk to me about the impact that had on the total deliberations.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, I think, look, women's voices, Indigenous voices, youth voices, they mattered in the climate negotiations, and they need to be a huge part of what's going forward. And that wedge was established in this meeting. I think it was felt in the negotiations, and it's there in the text. I also think we're having an incomplete conversation if we don't talk about small island states or those that are most impacted by climate change, because they, from a governance point of view, as I said earlier, didn't necessarily feel like they were treated fairly on things like loss and damage and adaptation and around climate finance. So although that commitment was made in the Paris Agreement for $100 billion a year for climate finance, it hasn't been met yet. And so there had to be a commitment to doubling down on meeting that, and actually, the rest of the world keeping their word. There was a wedge for adaptation, but not enough, because again, many of these countries are not talking about how they're going to mitigate emissions reductions. They're talking about how it is that their countries are going to survive in a climate adapted world. And then the final, like mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage are, I think, a set of three, and loss and damage was acknowledged, not enough. But there is the Glasgow dialogue, so a formal dialogue. This is one of those momentum things that's baked into the agreement, is that there's a formal place for a dialogue about how loss and damage will be treated, because you don't solve a problem like that in the crescendo of the last few hours. That's serious, substantial issues that be addressed.
I want to get Rick's view on this too, because we started and where were the yardsticks moved and where they wouldn't. I mean, this is by definition a global problem, which means unless there's a global solution, there is no solution. And we see this continuing gap that Velma raised between the developed world and the not so developed world, who doesn't have the financing to solve the problem, but in many ways bear a significantly larger brunt of the problem. Did we advance things in terms of making sure that the developing world is brought along on this challenge by the aid and assistance of the developed world, or are we still falling behind on that yardstick?
Well, I think we made some progress on it. I think the conversations become more coherent, more holistic, to use a phrase like that. I mean, the Western world, through private investment and through aid programs from governments and so on, puts trillions of dollars into the developing world. We've said we're going to stop doing that to finance coal plants, just because it's the cheapest thing you can build to get more energy to your people. We're not going to support that anymore. We may spend a bit more helping you develop wind and solar and renewables and so on, but we're not going to continue the old game. And that's quite important. I mean, the first world has already, we have this conversation about peak oil. When will demand for oil peak and start to decline? It already has in the first world, in Europe and North America, and some years ago. But it hasn't in the developing world. And what this conference did was start to address that in a different way. We're not just going to give you money for mitigation or for economic development. We're now going to tie it also to developing better practices for your own energy production within your country, and to get past deforestation, which is a form of economic development that supports agriculture. And so the conversation is starting to become more holistic, as opposed to just giving people money to offset loss and damages, as Velma was saying. I understand why that needs to happen, but why don't we do what we can to prevent that loss and damage, even in their own countries? I know some of it's being inflicted on them by things that we've done or are doing. But But the first world is actually starting to move in a pretty determined way to reduce those emissions. And the problem we're getting now is especially the fastest growing emerging countries, which is why we keep talking about China and India, are making the problem worse with their practices, and that really needs to stop, or else we're just going to be kind of caught in a treadmill forever.
We started, but just let me go to Bud, please.
Yep.
We talked earlier about the importance of the U.S.-China declaration. And we also talked about the Three Amigos meeting this week. And we talked about Article 6 and the notion that there actually, could be trans-border credits and losses associated with carbon emissions that are traded across the country. What do you anticipate from cooperation on the climate file on a North American-wide basis, Canada, US, and specific?
Well, I think the next step is that Gina McCarthy, who is Secretary John Kerry's sort of equivalent on the domestic side, she's the National Climate Advisor to President Biden, needs to probably become involved with a Canadian counterpart, because her job is to herd the cats on the US side with respect to the executive branch agencies and actions towards climate change. I know a top priority for the Canadian government is to make sure that the policies and the choices that governments are exercising are aligned across that border. It's a completely intertwined economy. So it would be great, I think, if Gina McCarthy were to come up to Ottawa, or at least to be engaged in some conversations to get that going.
Why not John Kerry?
Well, John Kerry is an outward-facing focus. His job is to build global ambition. He's not about herding the cats in the executive branch, from the West Wing. He's out there knocking on the doors of China, India, Korea, Indonesia to make them, think about what they could do to increase their ambition. So we've passed that first stage, John Kerry and then Minister Wilkinson. I think now it's Gina McCarthy and perhaps a suite of ministers from Canada.
Well, maybe
we
we
have 9 minutes left. And Velma, I want to ask you about something you said just in passing about the S curve. I mean, one of the more significant breakthrough, again, certainly from a lay person's perspective, was the so-called breakthrough agenda, a commitment on a whole bunch of fronts to use innovation to get low carbon hydrogen, reduce road transportation, clean steel, these sorts of things. You seem to be very, very optimistic about the role that technology can play in moving us towards these goals and targets.
Yeah, so it's not a technology exclusively, but this initiative and this initiative around the breakthrough agenda is very important, because what it's actually looking at doing is taking the smartest people in change management, in big change management, in global change management, in the level of change that we've never done before, because we are talking about transforming power systems and transforming transportation systems and addressing those issues that we raised earlier about the amount of charging infrastructure, and saying, how can we do it faster? What if we applied our best minds to making this happen faster? And so that is part of the acceleration that both, I think, Rick and I felt when we were there, is that there are a number of people not just looking, because we're past a certain point, maybe past a tipping point on some of these technologies. And the question is not whether we have the technology, it's how do we implement it faster, and how do we implement it within a 2030 timeline. So the S curve of innovation also says that while you make conservative estimates at the beginning and it starts off slowly, once it's in motion and once it's moving, we're back to this momentum question. It moves a lot faster than anybody thinks it's going to move.
Well, and I was also impressed. This isn't just European countries who are signing on to this agenda. This includes India and China on all fronts.
Right.
Yes, well, but that's the opportunity side of the question. That is absolutely the opportunity side of the question.
And that's why the momentum, in your view, was so important in this conference. Rick,
But
the private sector, you spent a lot of time with business. I mean, both in your own practice, your consulting practice, but at the conference. We don't normally associate the business community as really advancing the climate change agenda that much. And you think of policymakers, legislators. How were they received as a group, and what was their reaction to what was accomplished and what wasn't?
Well, I think the business community has shifted gears and is looking for the definition of what the opportunity of the energy transition looks like, and so they're encouraged in a macro way by what they saw at Glasgow. But they're also, following the path that you're talking about, Alan. I mean, one of the other differences, we don't talk about it that much here, is that half a dozen technology paths have opened up here and become more real to people. And so if you're one of those companies that needs to change your emission profile, to reduce your emissions, you actually now have 2 or 3 options. So now it's a question of, so how much does this one cost, and what are the pluses and minuses of that, and so on, how much is that one, and so on. And so it's actually becoming easier to challenge companies who aren't acting on these fronts, but also becoming something that they actually are doing now because it's good business. They're not just doing it as an act of charity. These are investment opportunities. Oil and gas companies are getting into hydrogen or CCUS or wind farms or solar because that's a good business practice. Oil and gas companies, people who sell gasoline at retail outlets, are looking at putting electric vehicle charging in there. Why are they doing that? It's not just to get a CSR, corporate social responsibility award. It's because that's where the market's going. That's where customers want them to be. I stopped at a gas station in northern France a few weeks ago, and there were as many electric vehicle charging stations at that, one of those big highway autoroute plazas. There were as many electric vehicle charging stations there, more in fact, than there were gas pumps.
Last question. COP27 is going to be held in Egypt, which unto itself, I think, will probably change the tenor of the discussion somewhat. But I want each of you in turn, we'll start with Velma, to say, what do you think is going to be the single biggest challenge and priority in the next COP conference?
Ratcheting up commitment from individual countries to hit the goal.
They will be under pressure to come back and report.
They are under pressure. It's baked into the Glasgow Climate Pact. There is a piece baked into the Climate Pact that says countries have to come back with NDCs by 2022 in Egypt.
And so they do that, and then what?
Well, and then we're back into all this same kind of conversation about how we're accelerating and what specifically is changing. And I think, as we all think about this, we have to start looking for signposts that tell us that we're moving, and maybe moving faster than we think we are. We're not running ourselves into a headwind where there's no change. 20% of the world's largest companies have made net zero commitments. This is part of the ESG, environment, social governance. This is part of inclusion. This is like, the world is moving in this direction. And so the question is not just, what do people have to put on the table? Yes, we have, in order to meet 1.5, we need people to do more, but we also need to be looking for signposts that say what we're doing is starting to work. And where are the opportunities, and more opportunities, large companies, small companies, cities, etc. Where are the opportunities in what's working about this, instead of constantly believing that we have to have a pitted fight?
Rick, if you were writing the agenda for COP27, what's the top priority?
It would be to do something I think probably still has work to do, which is to take that part of what we call the Paris Rulebook, the interpretation of what we agreed in Paris and then renewed here in Glasgow, and put it into concrete nuts and bolts, dollars and cents terms. Things that get pretty gritty and pretty complicated, like counting trees. If we're, for instance, going to use planting trees as a legitimate offset with economic value and bring billions of dollars into that equation, people want to know, A, those trees are really getting planted, and B, they're not being planted only to have some other tree a couple of miles down the road cut down. In other words, no net gain. Some of this, there were conversations going into Glasgow and continuing at Glasgow about how do we count the number of trees in the world. That sounds like a crazy idea, but we probably won't literally count them, but we'll measure the acreage that's covered by trees, and we'll say to Brazil, we're not going to give you money to stop deforestation unless you're actually net stopping deforestation. We're not going to stop it in one place only to have it continue someplace else, and in Indonesia and so on. So I think we're going to find that work still has work to do.
So both you and Velma are saying that the theme is really accountability, that's the phase we've really moved into, rather than virtue signaling.
Yes.
And last word to Bud. What's the top priority over the next year and going forward?
Well, I'd like to look a bit longer than COP27. Velma talked about the accelerating action, and that accelerating action is going to keep accelerating every year. The challenge here is that there's going to be the macroeconomic, results of this change in our energy system and our economy. And this is unlikely to be something that can be addressed at the UN, Framework Convention on Climate Change at one of the conferences of the parties. This is a bigger issue in terms of trying to figure out just transition, as well as basically the loss of value of capital stock and human intellectual capital that is going to be made obsolescent.
That's it for us. Great conversation today. Really good. Thank you so much, Collins. I'm proud to be your partner. Anyway, very good. Those of you who viewed, thank you also for joining us. You submitted a question and we didn't get to it. We will most emphatically write you back. Otherwise, we'll send you all a link to this conversation so you can watch it to your heart's content. And otherwise, stay tuned for our next series, which is at this point yet to be announced, but this will be an ongoing event that Earnscliffe sponsors. So again, thank you all and be safe.